Hi, I'm Helen Adams Keller, the 27th of June, 1880, the 1st of June, 1968. I was an American author, disability rights advocate, political activist and lecturer. I'm going to tell you a story about my life. Helen Keller was born on the 27th of June, 1880, in Tuscumbia, Alabama, the daughter of Arthur Henry Keller, 1836-1896, and Catherine Everett Adams Keller, 1856-1921, known as Kate. Her family lived on a homestead, Ivy Green, that Helen's paternal grandfather had built decades earlier. She had 4 siblings, her Mildred Campbell Keller, Tyson and Philip Brooks Keller, and 2 older half-brothers from her father's first marriage, James MacDonald Keller and William Simpson Keller. Keller's father worked for many years as an editor of the Tuscumbia North Alabama, and he had served as a captain in the Confederate Army. The family was part of the slaveholding elite before the American Civil War, but lost status later. Her mother was the daughter of Charles W. Adams, a Confederate general. Keller's paternal lineage was traced to Caspar Keller, a native of Switzerland. One of Helen's Swiss ancestors was the first teacher for the deaf in Zurich. Keller reflected on this fact in her first autobiography, asserting that there is no king who has not had a slave among his ancestors, and no slave who has not had a king among his. At 19 months old, Keller contracted an unknown illness described by doctors as an acute congestion of the stomach and the brain. Contemporary doctors believe it might have been meningitis, caused by the bacterium Neisseria meningitidis, meningococcus, or possibly Haemophilus influenzae. This could have caused the same symptoms, but is a less likely cause due to its 97% juvenile mortality rate. At that time, the illness left Keller both deaf and blind. She lived, as she recalled in her autobiography, at sea in a dense fog. At that time, Keller was able to communicate somewhat with Martha Washington, who was 2 years older and the daughter of the family cook, and understood the girl's signs by the age of 7. Keller had more than 60 home signs to communicate with her family, and could distinguish people by the vibration of their footsteps. In 1886, Keller's mother, inspired by an account in Charles Dickens' American Notes of the successful education of Laura Bridgman, a deaf and blind woman, dispatched the young Keller and her father to consult physician J. Julian Chisholm, an eye, ear, nose, and throat specialist in Baltimore, for advice. Chisholm referred the Kellers to Alexander Graham Bell, who was working with deaf children at the time. Bell advised them to contact the Perkins Institute for the Blind, the school where Bridgman had been educated. It was then located in South Boston. Michael Ananas, the school's director, asked Anne Sullivan, a 20-year-old alumna of the school who was visually impaired, to become Keller's instructor. It was the beginning of a nearly 50-year-long relationship. Sullivan developed as Keller's governess and later her companion. Anne Sullivan arrived at Keller's house on the 5th of March, 1887, a day Keller would forever remember as my soul's birthday. Anne Sullivan immediately began to teach Helen to communicate by spelling words into her hand, beginning with DOLL for the doll that she had brought Keller as a present. Keller initially struggled with lessons since she could not comprehend that every object had a word identifying it. When Sullivan was trying to teach Keller the word for mug, Keller became so frustrated she broke the mug. Keller remembered how she soon began imitating Sullivan's hand gestures. I did not know that I was spelling a word or even that words existed. I was simply making my fingers go in monkey-like imitation. The next month Keller made a breakthrough, when she realized that the motions her teacher was making on the palm of her hand, while running cool water over her other hand, symbolized the idea of water. Writing in her autobiography, The Story of My Life, Keller recalled the moment. I stood still, my whole attention fixed upon the motions of her fingers. Suddenly I felt a misty consciousness as of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought, and somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that WTER meant the wonderful cool something that was flowing over my hand. The living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, set it free. Keller quickly demanded that Sullivan sign the names of all the other familiar objects in her world. Helen Keller was viewed as isolated but was very in touch with the outside world. She was able to enjoy music by feeling the beat, and she was able to have a strong connection with animals through touch. She was delayed at picking up language, but that did not stop her from having a voice. In May 1888, Keller started attending the Perkins Institute for the Blind. In 1893, Keller, along with Sullivan, attended William Wade House and Finishing School. In 1894, Keller and Sullivan moved to New York to attend the Wright Humason School for the Deaf, and to learn from Sarah Fuller at the Horace Mann School for the Deaf. In 1896, they returned to Massachusetts, and Keller entered the Cambridge School for Young Ladies before gaining admittance, in 1900, to Radcliffe College of Harvard University, where she lived in Briggs Hall, South House. Her admirer, Mark Twain, had introduced her to Standard Oil magnate Henry Huddleston Rogers, who, with his wife Abby, paid for her education. In 1904, at the age of 24, Keller graduated as a member of Phi Beta Kappa from Radcliffe, becoming the first deafblind person to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree. She maintained a correspondence with the Austrian philosopher and pedagogue Wilhelm Jerusalem, who was one of the first to discover her literary talent. Determined to communicate with others as conventionally as possible, Keller learned to speak and spent much of her life giving speeches and lectures on aspects of her life. She learned to hear people's speech using the Tadoma method, which means using her fingers to feel the lips and throat of the speaker. She became proficient at using Braille and using fingerspelling to communicate. Shortly before World War I, with the assistance of the Zollner Quartet, she determined that by placing her fingertips on a resonant tabletop she could experience music played close by. Anne Sullivan stayed as a companion to Helen Keller long after she taught her. Sullivan married John Massey in 1905, and her health started failing around 1914. Polly Thompson, the 20th of February, 1885, the 21st of March, 1960, was hired to keep house. She was a young woman from Scotland who had no experience with deaf or blind people. She progressed to working as a secretary as well, and eventually became a constant companion to Keller. Keller moved to Forest Hills, Queens, together with Sullivan and Massey, and used the house as a base for her efforts on behalf of the American Foundation for the Blind. While in her 30s, Helen had a love affair, became secretly engaged, and defied her teacher and family by attempting an elopement with the man she loved. He was the fingerspelling socialist Peter Fagan, a young Boston Herald reporter who was sent to Helen's home to act as her private secretary when lifelong companion, Anne, fell ill. At the time, her father had died and Sullivan was recovering in Lake Placid and Puerto Rico. Keller had moved with her mother in Montgomery, Alabama. Anne Sullivan died in 1936, with Keller holding her hand. After falling into a coma as a result of coronary thrombosis, Keller and Thompson moved to Connecticut. They traveled worldwide and raised funds for the blind. Thompson had a stroke in 1957 from which she never fully recovered and died in 1960. Winnie Cobley, a nurse originally hired to care for Thompson in 1957, stayed on after Thompson's death and was Keller's companion for the rest of her life. On the 22nd of January, 1916, Keller and Sullivan traveled to the small town of Menomonee in western Wisconsin to deliver a lecture at the Mabel Tainter Memorial Building. Details of her talk were provided in the weekly Dunn County News on the 22nd of January, 1916. A message of optimism, of hope, of good cheer, and of loving service was brought to Menomonee Saturday, a message that will linger long with those fortunate enough to have received it. This message came with the visit of Helen Keller and her teacher, Mrs. John Massey, and both had a hand in imparting it Saturday evening to a splendid audience that filled the memorial. The wonderful girl who has so brilliantly triumphed over the triple afflictions of blindness, dumbness and deafness, gave a talk with her own lips on happiness, and it will be remembered always as a piece of inspired teaching by those who heard it. Keller became a world-famous speaker and author. She was an advocate for people with disabilities, amid numerous other causes. She traveled to 25 different countries giving motivational speeches about deaf people's conditions. 43. She was a suffragist, pacifist, radical socialist, birth control supporter, and opponent of Woodrow Wilson. In 1915, she and George A. Kessler founded the Helen Keller International, HKI, organization. This organization is devoted to research in vision, health, and nutrition. In 1916, she sent money to the NAACP, as she was ashamed of the Southern unchristian treatment of colored people. In 1920, Keller helped to found the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU. She traveled to over 40 countries with Sullivan, making several trips to Japan and becoming a favorite of the Japanese people. Keller met every U.S. president from Grover Cleveland to Lyndon B. Johnson and was friends with many famous figures, including Alexander Graham Bell, Charlie Chaplin and Mark Twain. Keller and Twain were both considered political radicals allied with leftist politics. In 1909 Keller became a member of the Socialist Party. She actively campaigned and wrote in support of the working class from 1909 to 1921. Many of her speeches and writings were about women's right to vote and the effects of war. In addition, she supported causes that opposed military intervention. She had speech therapy to have her voice understood better by the public. When the Rockefeller-owned press refused to print her articles, she protested until her work was finally published. She supported Socialist Party candidate Eugene V. Debs in each of his campaigns for the presidency. Before reading Progress and Poverty by Henry George, Helen Keller was already a socialist who believed that Georgism was a good step in the right direction. She later wrote of finding in Henry George's philosophy a rare beauty and power of inspiration, and a splendid faith in the essential nobility of human nature. Keller claimed that newspaper columnists who had praised her courage and intelligence before she expressed her socialist views now called attention to her disabilities. The editor of the Brooklyn Eagle wrote that her mistakes sprung out of the manifest limitations of her development. Keller responded to that editor, referring to having met him before he knew of her political views. At that time the compliments he paid me were so generous that I blush to remember them. But now that I have come out for socialism, he reminds me and the public that I am blind and deaf and especially liable to error. I must have shrunk in intelligence during the years since I met him. Oh, ridiculous Brooklyn Eagle. Socially blind and deaf, it defends an intolerable system, a system that is the cause of much of the physical blindness and deafness which we are trying to prevent. In 1912, Keller joined the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, known as the Wobblies, saying that parliamentary socialism was sinking in the political bog. She wrote for the IWW between 1916 and 1918. In Why I Became an IWW, Keller explained that her motivation for activism came in part from her concern about blindness and other disabilities. I was appointed on a commission to investigate the conditions of the blind. For the first time I, who had thought blindness a misfortune beyond human control, found that too much of it was traceable to wrong industrial conditions, often caused by the selfishness and greed of employers, and the social evil contributed its share. I found that poverty drove women to a life of shame that ended in blindness. The last sentence refers to prostitution and syphilis, the former a life of shame that women used to support themselves, which contributed to their contracting syphilis. Untreated, it was a leading cause of blindness. In the same interview, Keller also cited the 1912 strike of textile workers in Lawrence, Massachusetts for instigating her support of socialism. Keller supported eugenics, which had become popular with new understandings, as well as misapprehensions, of principles of biological inheritance. In 1915, she wrote in favor of refusing life-saving medical procedures to infants with severe mental impairments or physical deformities, saying that their lives were not worthwhile and they would likely become criminals. Keller also expressed concerns about human overpopulation. From 1946 to 1957 Keller visited 35 countries. In 1948 she went to New Zealand and visited deaf schools in Christchurch and Auckland. She met Deaf Society of Canterbury Life member Patty Still in Christchurch. Keller wrote a total of 12 published books and several articles. One of her earliest pieces of writing, at age 11, was The Frost King, 1891. There were allegations that this story had been plagiarized from The Frost Fairies by Margaret Canby. An investigation into the matter revealed that Keller may have experienced a case of cryptomnesia, which was that she had Canby's story read to her but forgot about it, while the memory remained in her subconscious. At age 22, Keller published her autobiography, The Story of My Life, 1903, with help from Sullivan and Sullivan's husband, John Massey. It recounts the story of her life up to age 21 and was written during her time in college. In an article Keller wrote in 1907, she brought to public attention the fact that many cases of childhood blindness could be prevented by washing the eyes of every newborn baby with a disinfectant solution. At the time, only a fraction of doctors and midwives were doing this. Thanks to Keller's advocacy, this common-sense public health measure was swiftly and widely adopted. Keller wrote The World I Live in 1908, giving readers an insight into how she felt about the world. Out of the Duck, a series of essays on socialism, was published in 1913. When Keller was young, Anne Sullivan introduced her to Phillips Brooks, who introduced her to Christianity. Keller famously saying, "I always knew he was there, but I didn't know his name." Her spiritual autobiography, My Religion, 61, was published in 1927 and then in 1994 extensively revised and reissued under the title Light in My Darkness. It advocates the teachings of Emanuel Swedenborg, the Christian theologian and mystic who gave a spiritual interpretation of the teachings of the Bible and who claimed that the second coming of Jesus Christ had already taken place. Keller had a series of strokes in 1961 and spent the last years of her life at her home. On the 14th of September, 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of the United States' two highest civilian honors. In 1965 she was elected to the National Women's Hall of Fame at the New York World's Fair. Keller devoted much of her later life to raising funds for the American Foundation for the Blind. She died in her sleep on the 1st of June, 1968, at her home, Alcan Ridge, located in Easton, Connecticut, at the age of 87. A service was held at the Washington National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., and her body was cremated in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Her ashes were buried at the Washington National Cathedral next to her constant companions, Anne Sullivan and Polly Thompson.